of the good, and she is distinguishing it from an subjectivist and intrinsic theory. The intrinsic theory holds that the good is in the objects themselves, regardless of their relations to the actors who pursue values. So objects are just of value, regardless of any relationship in which they might stand to the person who values them. Now, interestingly, you'll see that the last sentence of the first paragraph says that part of what this conception does is divorce the concept of value from valuer and purpose. Now, valuer is not a normal common English word. I think I had to add it to my spell check, right? It comes from thinking of value as primarily a verb, to value something, which is a verb in English, in addition to a value of mine, right? And a valuer is somebody who performs that verb. So in this paragraph, we have a certain conception of valuing. Valuing is an action. It's something one does. One is a valuer. And because valuing is an action, there's something illegitimate about divorcing it from the person who does it. It would be like saying there's running in the world. There are no runners, no one runs, but there is running out there. Likewise, if you think of valuing as an action, to say there are values irregardless and unconnected to the people who value is the same kind of error. It's a stealing of a concept. Okay, turning now to the third paragraph in this quote, we get a restatement of what's wrong with the intrinsic and subjective theories, and just focus on the intrinsic now. The intrinsic theory that holds that the good resides in some sort of reality independent of what? Independent of man, but in particular independent of man's consciousness, she writes. Now, so valuing is an activity, but it's in particular a conscious activity. So it's not just to say that there's valuing without valuers, or irregardless of valuers, is not just like saying there's running irregardless of people, runners, but it's in particular identifying the action with a certain faculty of man. Valuing is not just something we do, it's something we consciously do. Valuing is an aspect of consciousness in some way. And yet, she's very clear also to distinguish her view from the subjectivist view, the view that valuing amounts to nothing, that something's being of value or being good amounts to nothing more than one's conscious attitude towards it. And in particular, from the idea that valuing is arbitrary, so that whatever you want or desire is good. So something is of value relative to a valuer, and not only relative to him, but relative to his consciousness in some way. His consciousness is involved in it being of value. And yet, it's not arbitrary. He doesn't just make up what's of value to him. It's not just its being of value isn't exhausted by his wanting it. And I think these two false views, the intrinsic view and the subjective view, it's important to just go through one more iteration of them, because it's a little bit puzzling to a lot of people how this could be. And to bring out what's being said here, I want to differentiate what she's rejecting in rejecting intrinsicism and saying that value has to be objective rather than intrinsic, from something that is a plausible thing somebody might hold and might put in similar terms. When I was first grasping objectivism, the first differentiation I made when I was sort of rejecting intrinsic value, what are we rejecting, is captured by what sort of comes off the page first and most easily from her first statement of this in the first paragraph. The intrinsic theory holds that the good is inherent in certain things or action as such, regardless of their context and consequences, regardless of any benefit or injury they may cause to the actors and subjects involved. So you would think that the good would be something like world peace or something. If you think world peace is good, regardless of whether anyone wants it, and not good because it helps people, it's just a good state of affairs. Or the environmentalist idea that the good is, nature's being undespoiled. Or the kind of Kantian idea that the good is everybody following their duty. And these things are good irregardless of what effects they have on anybody, or regardless of what effects they have on anybody. But what about something like health? You say that health is a value. Health is not a value, though, regardless of its effects on somebody. You can't say there's just a lot of health in the world. Health is a feature of somebody. Somebody is healthy, right? And my health is good for me, and your health is good for you, and so forth. So you might think that health is the sort of thing that's an objective rather than an intrinsic value. And in a way it is. I think health is an objective value. But if you think of it this way, there's something that's missing. Because suppose I were to say, as some people do, I were to read up on some medical journals or something, and I was to find a certain lifestyle and determine that this is the most healthy lifestyle. You shouldn't eat many carbohydrates, and you should have sea algae, and I heard someone's trying to eat like cave people because they're supposed to be healthier or something. And I work out this way of life that's the most healthy, and I say, okay, this is a value. You should all go about this way, eating plankton and catching pigeons to eat and so forth, because this is the most healthy. It's not an intrinsic value. It's not good regardless of the consequences. It's good for you. It's healthy, and therefore you should do it. And it's immoral not to, because after all, this is an objective value. It's something that's good for you because of its consequences on you. And you say, but, I don't like plankton and raw pigeon grilled over a fire. I want some chocolate. And I say, well, he says, you're being an intrinsicist. You're demanding that I do something because you say it's good. And I say, no, I'm taking into account it's good for you. It's not just that pigeons ought to get eaten by people in, loincloths. It's, for you, you'd be better off eating this pigeon. And you say, no, I don't want it. It's not good for, you tell me why I should want this. And say, well, it's good for you. And you say, so what? Not good for anything I want. Your consciousness isn't involved, in other words. Your desires are totally unrelated to this way of life that I'm trying to foist on you. And I'm not saying, it's not that your desires rule and your desires should be all that matters, but just the fact that something has consequences on you, independent of your desires, doesn't make it an objective value. And there are schools of philosophy which work more or less like this fanciful example I'm making up of the health food nut. In particular, this is how Aristotelian ethics works. There's the idea that there's a certain life which is what we would call an objectivism, man's life, and it's the standard of value. That's not the term the Aristotelians use, but it's a certain type of life, the way of living that embodies these virtues. And that's just what's good for people. Why is it? It's good for oneself. One ought to, for one's own sake, try to have this kind of life. And you say, well, why? Why should I have this kind of life? And they don't really have an answer. They say, well, it's good for you. And you say, well, I don't know if it's good for me. What if I don't want this kind of life? How can you show me that it's good for me? What makes it good for me? And there's just not an answer. It's your natural end, they say, and there's just nothing more to say about it. And I think that that's part of what Ayn Rand is rejecting when she's rejecting intrinsicism, and when she's saying that our consciousness values our values. It involves a relation to our consciousness, not just to us. And yet, it's not just that our desires constitute what's of value to us. And so we're going to talk about later in the class how that works. As a preview of that, now before we jump back to the earlier Ayn Rand, the idea is that you have to choose to live before value concepts can have any relevance to you. And if you choose to live, that's something you do consciously, then if you want to live, if you desire to live, then we can show relative to that desire that this whole way of life, what we call man's life, is the way to live. And that's how we can validate that as a standard. You choose to live, and this is how to live if you're going to live. This is the kind of life that you can live if you want to live. Otherwise, you can't at all, and you'll be undermining your life. So this idea of a choice to live, wanting to live, as something one consciously does, is, I think, very deep in Ayn Rand's ethical thought, and it's something that has caused people a lot of confusion. People have raised objections to objectivism based on this. I think the objections aren't that difficult to answer, but it's also in the minds of people who haven't been objecting to it per se. Just, there's been a lot of confusion, or a lot of people anyway find it confusing how to understand this idea of a choice to live. Who are the people who don't choose to live anyway? Are they people who commit suicide or what? And I think this is the kind of thing that we can get purchase on by looking at this theme of valuing in Ayn Rand's, running throughout Ayn Rand's work. Now, the thing that really impressed me about, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So the strict diet, which is viewed by someone else that wants to eat chocolate,